Hello everyone, welcome to HFY Beyond Terror. This channel is all about HFY and sci-fi stories, where humanity's underestimated and then proves.
When Princess Selene of the Leary Dominion took a human husband, the court reacted the way courts always do, by turning fear into manners and manners into knives. They did not insult her outright, not in public, not while the listening drones hovered like jeweled insects above the marble. Instead, they said things like a bold diplomatic gesture and a charming novelty, and how refreshing that his grace is so modest. Modest. Selene could taste the word the way she tasted bitterness in tea. The nobles meant small. They meant weak. They meant temporary. Her husband made it easy for them. Elias Mar wore no ceremonial armor, no ribbons, no medals. At court functions, he kept his dark hair tied back and his posture loose, as if he were attending a garden party instead of the engine room of an empire. When the Dominion's veteran admirals bowed stiffly, Elias bowed like a man learning the custom, not a man eager to dominate it. And when the courtiers circled him, testing, probing, looking for pride to hook, he gave them nothing. He smiled, he listened. He asked questions about rainfall patterns on the capital world and whether the palace orchards were struggling with blight. The Leary found this hilarious. Their world was a single blue jewel with perfect climate control and engineered seasons. Their orchards were as curated as their bloodlines. Selene, however, had grown up in palaces that swallowed people. She understood what they were doing. They weren't laughing because he talked about trees. They were laughing because he refused to talk about power. And in the Dominion, refusal was either ignorance or insult. "You're enjoying this," Selene murmured that evening, once they were alone in the quiet of her private wing. The palace walls were grown from living stone. They hummed faintly like a sleeping animal. Outside the balcony, the capital's rings shone in the night, silver bands around a green heart. Elias loosened the collar clasp of his formal coat and smiled like someone who'd escaped a too-tight cage. Enjoying what? Being underestimated. He tilted his head, feigning innocence poorly. "Me never." Selene crossed her arms. "They think you're harmless." Elias looked at her a long moment, and the humor drained from his face, leaving something calmer behind, something still. "Harmless," he repeated softly, as if tasting it. Then he shrugged. "It's a useful costume." Selene knew humans. She de-studied them. Earth had endured its wars, its consolidations, its near extinctions, the slow, painful climb into space. Humans didn't survive by being harmless. But her court hadn't studied anything except each other. That, more than any insult, was why Selene had chosen Elias Mar. He wasn't a conquering warlord with an appetite for thrones. He wasn't a pretty ornament of a spouse to parade as proof of her open-mindedness. He was, according to the Dominion's files, an agricultural liaison, a former naval officer turned planetary reconstruction specialist. A man with no political base, no noble patrons, no dynastic ambitions. A man who could not threaten the old families. That was what made him perfect. Because Selene wasn't trying to keep the Dominion comfortable. She was trying to keep it alive. The first attempt on her life came during the Festival of Tides. It was supposed to be sacred. Leary traditions were always sacred when they were profitable. The palace opened its lower terraces to the public, and water was pumped in shining sheets through carved channels. The air smelled of salt and flowers. Citizens poured in wearing ribbons and laughter, eager to see the princess and her human consort wave from the platform above the cascade. Selene stood at the rail, her ceremonial mantle clasped at her throat. Elias stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the stone as if he could feel the vibration of the crowd through it. "Look," Selene whispered and meant it. When she was a child, the people had been shapes behind security fields. Now she could see individual faces, old Leary with silver eye flecks, younglings balanced on parents' shoulders, a cluster of human diplomats near the front, their expressions cautious but bright. Selene lifted her hand to greet them. The shot was almost invisible. A flicker in the air, a hiss like a swallowed breath, a tiny flash of distortion as an accelerated projectile cut through the festival's damp atmosphere. Selene never saw it. Elias did. He moved without drama, without warning, one step, a twist of his shoulders, his arm crossing in front of her like a closing door. The impact was a dull thud against his forearm. Selene blinked. For a fraction of a heartbeat, she did not understand what had happened, only that Elias' coat sleeve had torn and something dark spread beneath. Then the world roared into motion. Security fields snapped on, drones screamed alarms, the crowd below surged like a panicked tide. Selene grabbed Elias' arm. "You're hit." "I'm fine," he said, voice clipped. "That's blood. It's a flesh wound." Selene stared at him. "A what wound?" He met her eyes. For the first time since their marriage announcement, the mask slipped. Beneath it was something sharp and focused, like a blade finally drawn. "Stay behind me," he said. Selene's heart hammered, not from fear for herself. She had lived with death as a possibility since childhood, but from the sudden, jarring realization that the human she'd brought into the palace was not merely brave. He was prepared. Elias pressed his fingers to his wrist, and his ring, simple, dull metal, lit briefly. A whisper of an energy field flared around his forearm. The projectile embedded in his sleeve fell out and clinked onto the stone terrace. A slug, not a ceremonial dueling dart, not a traditional assassin's needle. A human slug, old-fashioned, chemically propelled. A message. Elias knelt, scooped it up, and frowned. "They're trying to make this look like a human did it." Selene's blood ran cold. "To break the treaty." "To break you," Elias corrected. He stood and looked out over the chaos below, scanning the terraces the way a predator scans tall grass. "How many enemies do you have?" he asked. Selene swallowed. "How many minutes do you have?" Elias huffed a humorless laugh. "Fair." His gaze snagged on something, a flicker of movement near a maintenance archway. He didn't shout. He didn't point. He simply stepped to the side as if adjusting his stance, and his other hand slid into the inner pocket of his coat. Selene's eyes widened. "Elias, SHH." He withdrew a small device the size of a coin, thumbed it, and tossed it gently over the railing. It fell like a dropped petal. Then the archway below erupted in a burst of white foam, not fire, not shrapnel. Foam expanding instantly into a thick mass that swallowed the space, sealing the corridor like a plug in a drain. Screams echoed. Security drones swarmed. Selene stared at him. "You have non-lethal containment," Elias said. "Standard for disaster zones." People panic. "You need tools that stop them without killing them." Selene's throat tightened. "And assassins. Assassins are just people who panic with a plan." He glanced at her and something softer flickered across his face. "Are you hurt?" Selene shook her head. Elias exhaled once, then straightened. "Okay, then we're leaving now." The court convened an emergency council before sunset. The Chamber of Tides was carved into the palace bedrock, a circular hall with a pool at its center. The water reflected the ceiling's constellation lights. Around it stood the Dominion's great families, House Veth with their black and gold throat plates, House Arun with their jeweled crests, and half a dozen others who smiled too easily. Selene sat on the raised dais, her hands clasped tightly. Elias stood behind her throne instead of beside it. That alone made the room uneasy. The Chancellor, a narrow-faced Leary named Keshel, spoke first. An attempt on your Highness's life during a holy festival is an outrage. The Dominion will find the culprit. Several nobles murmured in agreement. House Veth's matriarch inclined her head. Of course, though the projectile appears human. Her gaze slid to Elias, polite as a knife. How tragic that such violence follows the princess into her marriage. Selene felt anger rise, hot, familiar, dangerous. Elias spoke before she could. "May I?" he asked. The court blinked. A human asking permission in a crisis, proper, deferential. Selene nodded. Elias stepped forward, sleeves rolled slightly. A clean bandage wrapped his forearm. He looked for once like a man who belonged in a room where decisions killed people. The slug was human-made, Elias said calmly. But it was fired from a Leary maintenance corridor using Dominion access codes. We sealed the corridor with expanding foam. Your security recovered 2 individuals wearing festival worker uniforms. One carried a Leary comm unit with encrypted Dominion frequencies. He paused. Let the facts settle. House Veth's matriarch clicked her tongue. So you suggest a Leary did it. Convenient. Elias smiled, small, almost friendly. I suggest someone wants you to think a human did it. Convenient. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Selene watched the nobles shift, their eyes darting like fish in shallow water. Keshel cleared his throat. This is serious. Do you have evidence of motive? Elias looked around the circle. If Princess Selene dies, the marriage treaty collapses. The Dominion's alliance with Earth fractures. Human trade roots close. Food shipments, especially grain and protein cultures, stop. Several nobles stiffened. They didn't like being reminded that the Dominion's perfect world's imported necessities now that their own agricultural systems had been optimized for delicacies instead of survival. Elias continued, voice steady. If the alliance collapses, border skirmishes with the Car Pact resume. The Dominion's fleets are overextended. Your shipyards are behind schedule by, he glanced at Selene, who gave a tiny nod, by 3 years. House Arun's representative bristled. How would you know our shipyard? Elias turned to her. Because you asked my team to rebuild your orbital foundry after the coolant breach last quarter. You signed the request. Silence. Selene's pulse steadied. This was the Elias she'd chosen. Not a warrior shouting threats, but a man holding a ledger of reality. And if the Dominion falls into war, Elias said, your houses lose power, unless his gaze slid to House Veth. Someone believes they can seize the throne in the chaos. A collective inhale, the matriarch's eyes glittered. An accusation. Elias spread his hands. A possibility, the same way a loaded weapon is a possibility. Keshel raised a hand. Enough, we will investigate. Investigation takes time, Elias interrupted, still polite, still calm. Assassination attempts don't. A murmur of outrage fluttered through the chamber. Humans did not interrupt chancellors. Elias didn't seem to notice. I propose immediate protective measures, he said. Secure routes, rotating schedules, independent comm encryption, and an audit of maintenance corridors connected to royal platforms. House Veth's matriarch smiled coldly. You propose to reorganize palace security, you a foreigner. Elias met her gaze. I propose we keep the princess alive. Selene watched the room. Saw who flinched, saw who looked relieved, saw who looked angry that the human had said the quiet thing aloud. She leaned forward, voice carrying across the pool. The human is my husband. His safety is my concern. My safety is yours. She let her eyes settle on House Veth. If any house values tradition over survival, it may find tradition is a poor shield. The matriarch's smile tightened. Elias stepped back behind Seleni's throne. And Selene realized with a sudden twist in her chest that her court had made a crucial mistake. They thought Elias was harmless because he did not hunger for power. They did not understand that the most dangerous people were often those who didn't need it. The second attempt came 3 nights later, quieter. Selene woke to darkness, not the comfortable dim of palace night lights. This was absence, as if the room had been swallowed. Her throat tightened. Her pulse spiked. Beside her, Elias was already awake. He lay utterly still, eyes open, listening. Then Selene heard it too, a faint, rhythmic whisper, the sound of a cutting tool. Elias rose without sound, slid from the bed, and gestured for Selene to stay. He moved to the wall where a decorative panel of living stone displayed the royal crest. The whispering grew louder. Someone was cutting through. Selene's palms went cold. Security fields should have stopped this. Elias pressed his hand to the stone. For a moment he looked almost sorry. Then he whispered, "They're using the palace's own growth patterns. They're not cutting, they're coaxing." Selene's eyes widened. "Who?" The stone panel bulged inward. A thin blade slipped through. Elias moved. He didn't lunge like a brute. He stepped into the angle of the blade, caught it between his palms like a prayer, and twisted. Metal shrieked. A muffled curse sounded from inside the wall. Elias pulled hard, and a figure tumbled through, half spilling into Selene's chamber, tangled in vines of living stone. The assassin wore palace maintenance gray. His face was masked. Elias pinned him with a knee to the chest and spoke in a voice Selene had never heard from him, low, precise, and utterly uninterested in negotiation. "Who sent you?" the assassin spat. Elias sighed as if inconvenienced, then reached into his pocket and produced a small injector. He jabbed it into the assassin's neck. The assassin's struggle slowed, then stopped. Selene stared. Did you kill him?" Elias shook his head. "Sedative. He'll wake in custody with a headache and a lot of regret." He looked up at Selene, eyes steady. "Are you okay?" Selene swallowed hard. "I was about to ask you the same." Elias' mouth twitched. "Fair." He dragged the assassin fully into the room, tapped his ring again. A signal pulsed. Within seconds, security drones thudded outside the door, late but arriving. Selene's voice came out rough. "How did you know what to do?" Elias glanced at the wall, at the torn crest panel, at the vines shivering with disturbed growth. "Because palace security is designed around ceremony. It assumes threats are loud and honorable." He looked back at her. "My old job taught me that the worst threats are quiet and impatient." Selene's heart hammered, not from fear now, but from fury. "They're escalating." "Yes," Elias said, "because the first attempt failed and they expected you to be shaken into retreat." Selene's jaw clenched. "I won't retreat." Elias' gaze softened. "I know." He hesitated, then added, "But they might not stop until they're sure you can't win." Selene stared at him. "Then we make them sure." The trap was simple, which was why it worked. Selene announced a private pilgrimage to the shrine of First Water, a small, ancient sanctuary on a cliff overlooking the sea. Tradition demanded privacy. Tradition demanded a minimal escort. Tradition demanded vulnerability. House Veth smiled and offered blessings. House Arun offered ceremonial guards. Selene declined them all and accepted only palace security, and publicly only Elia's. The court whispered, the people cheered, and somewhere in the palace's veins, enemies repositioned. On the morning of the pilgrimage, Selene and Elias rode a small skimmer down the cliff roads. The sea wind was sharp. The shrine's white stones gleamed ahead like teeth. Elias sat beside her, hands relaxed on his knees. "You're too calm," Selene murmured. Elias' eyes scanned the horizon. "I'm not calm, I'm focused." Selene watched him. "You didn't tell me you were trained for this." Elias' jaw tightened. "You didn't marry me for my hobbies." Selene huffed a quiet laugh. "No, I married you because you looked at my empire like it was a problem you could solve." Elias glanced at her. "And you married me because you were tired of people who treated problems like decorations." Selene's throat tightened at the accuracy. They approached the shrine. No guards waited, no attendants, just an open archway and the sea beyond. Selene stepped off the skimmer, her ceremonial cloak snapping in the wind. Elias followed, eyes sharp. They entered the shrine. It smelled of salt and old stone. The first explosion didn't come from the shrine. It came from the road behind them, a thunderous crack. Then the skimmer erupted in a bloom of fire. Selene spun, heart lurching. Elias' hand caught her elbow. "Don't look, move." They ran deeper into the shrine as debris rained outside. The cliff road was blocked now, trapped. Selene's lungs burned. "They're trying to isolate us." "Yes," Elias said, "and they think they have." They reached the shrine's inner chamber, a circular room open to the sea with a pool at its center. The water was clear, fed by an underground spring. Selene's breath caught. Figures stepped from the shadows, 3, then 5, then 8. Palace greys, masks, blades, and compact weapons. Selene's hands clenched. She had a ceremonial dagger at her hip, useless against 8. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between her and them. The leader's voice came muffled through his mask. "Human, step aside, you are not the target." Elias' voice was mild. "That's where you're wrong." The leader clicked his tongue. "You're a consort, a pet, the princess's indulgence." Selene felt anger surge, but Elias lifted his hand slightly. "Wait." Elias spoke softly. "Do you know why humans built weapons before we built stars?" The assassins shifted, confused. "Because," Elias continued, "we learned early that the universe doesn't care about your title." He tapped his ring. The shrine's pool erupted, not in a splash, in a sudden surge of thick, pale foam blooming from beneath the water like a living thing. It expanded fast, swallowing the floor, rolling toward the assassins in hungry waves. They shouted, stumbling back, boots sticking as the foam grabbed them. Selene stared, shocked. Elias grabbed her hand. "Run." They sprinted along the edge of the chamber, foam rising behind them like a tidal wall. One assassin broke free and lunged. Elias pivoted, caught the attacker's wrist, and used the man's momentum against him, twisting, levering, dropping him into the foam with a muffled scream. Selene's mind reeled. He moved like he'd practiced this in nightmares. They reached a narrow passage leading out toward the cliff face, an old maintenance route carved in the shrine's bones. Elias shoved Selene through. "Go." Selene stumbled, then turned. "You're coming." Elias nodded once, eyes hard. "I'm coming." He stepped back into the chamber just as 2 assassins, half-trapped in foam, fired compact pulse pistols. Elias moved fast, ducking behind a stone pillar. Energy scorched the air. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out something Selene hadn't known he carried, a small, ugly cylinder. He tossed it. It hit the foam and detonated in a burst of bright light and sound, a flash bang tuned for leery senses. The assassins screamed, clutching their heads. Elias surged forward, not killing, not indulging rage, simply removing threats with ruthless efficiency. A strike to a nerve cluster, a twist of a weapon, a shove into foam, a knee to the sternum. Within seconds, the chamber fell silent except for the hiss of expanding containment foam and the distant roar of the sea. Elias stood among them, breathing hard. Selene stared at him from the passage, chest tight. He looked up, met her eyes, and for an instant she saw something raw there, not pride, not triumph, but a weary grief. "Elias," she whispered. He walked to her, took her hand, and pulled her into the passage. "Let's go," he said. They emerged onto a narrow ledge carved into the cliff, wind screaming past them. Below, the sea churned. Above, the sky was clear, and a Dominion patrol craft streaked toward the shrine, sirens wailing. Selene blinked. "How?" Elias held up his ring. "I told security we were taking the pilgrimage route. I told them to shadow us from a distance. I told them if the skimmer exploded, they had 60 seconds before I started making my own exits." Selene stared at him. "You expected." "I prepared," Elias said quietly. "Expectation is hope. Preparation is love." The patrol craft hovered, lowering a winch. Selene let the wind whip her hair across her face, and she laughed, once sharp and breathless. The sound startled her. Elias glanced at her, and despite everything, his mouth curved faintly. Selene stepped onto the winch platform, then turned back to him, eyes shining with salt air and something else. "Now what?" she asked. Elias looked toward the palace in the distance, its towers gleaming like blades. "Now we stop playing defense." Selene's smile turned fierce. "Good." They rose into the sky, leaving the shrine below, leaving the foam, the trapped assassins, the failed conspiracy. And Selene knew the court would hear two stories by nightfall. One, that enemies tried to kill the princess. Two, that the human consort, quiet, modest, harmless, stood in the way. The first story would scare them. The second would change how they looked at him. Because in the Dominion, power was supposed to be inherited, displayed, and obeyed. Elias Mar had power of a different kind. The kind that didn't ask permission. The kind that only appeared when someone threatened what he loved. Selene leaned into the wind and watched the palace grow closer. Let them whisper, she thought. Let them finally understand. Harmless was never the word.